Welcome, online viewers. My name is Terence Maloon. This is the fourth in a series of lectures on the 50 years that changed painting. I'd like to thank Andrew Dyer and Donna Marie Kelly, who have generously sponsored this series and its transfer online, and thank the Australian National University, and specifically the Drill Hole Gallery, and its director, Tony Oates, for having made this series possible. It's estimated that between 2 and 3 million people turned out to line the route between the Arc de Triomphe and the Pantheon in Paris to witness Victor Hugo's funeral procession. It was the first time ever that a creative artist had been accorded a state funeral in France. Victor Hugo was the author of tremendously famous blockbuster novels such as Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. He was a fantastically successful playwright with his play Hernani, first performed in 1830, this being considered the signal event, the point of arrival of French Romanticism. Hugo's dramas were all written in verse. He was a brilliantly accomplished poet whose collections of poetry became bestsellers. If that were not enough, he was also an eminent parliamentarian whose Republican and socialist convictions made him a leading adversary of the restored monarchy under Napoleon III, which led to Hugo spending 18 years in exile in Belgium and on the Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey. When he returned to France in 1870, he received a hero's welcome. At the time of his death, Victor Hugo had spent about 60 years in the public eye. His industriousness was legendary. These days, we are obliged to produce a lot, Baudelaire matter-of-factly observed, and Hugo was as productive and as prolix as any other 19th century writer, and probably more than any other, right up there with Charles Dickens, Balzac, Alexandre Dumas, John Ruskin, Émile Zola, etc., etc. But Hugo's collected works runs to 48 volumes, consisting of the works he published in his lifetime, and there are an additional 16 volumes of his unpublished writings. The millions who lined the route to the Pantheon were paying tribute not only to a great writer, but to an exemplary thinker, the first public intellectual of modern times. Hugo had won over a mass public. He was an artist for the masses as never before. And with his passing, those millions of people in the streets and hanging off every balcony along the way knew full well that they were witnessing the end of an era. Very much like his contemporary Eugène Delacroix, Hugo worked on an epic scale. As Baudelaire put it, the excessive, the immense, were the natural domain of Victor Hugo. Delacroix's chosen masters were Rubens and Michelangelo, whereas Hugo's were Shakespeare, Dante, and Byron, as well as the medieval French poet Ronsard. In both instances, the modern or modernist-tending features of their works aren't readily discernible to us today, but they're certainly there to be discovered. Just as Delacroix's successors, Manet, Whistler, Degas, etc., are unmistakably modern painters, so Victor Hugo's successors, most notably Baudelaire and Mallarmé, are unmistakably modern poets. In between their respective generations, an insurmountable breach had opened up between old and new, between then and now, between old and young, and there was no question of going back. Here's a snippet of a text I found recently in an anthology of translations of Victor Hugo's writings. The text evidently dates from the 1870s, hence after Hugo's return from exile. And obviously it is written in full confidence that his words will be heard and that they will resonate with the public, who will surely come around to endorsing them in the fullness of time. For the last 80 years, memorable things have been done. A wonderful heap of demolished materials covers the pavement. What is done is but little by the side of what remains to be done. To destroy is the task, to build is the work. Progress demolishes with the left hand, and it is with the right hand that it builds. The left hand of progress is called force. The right hand is called mind. There is, at this hour, a great deal of useful destruction accomplished. All the old cumbersome civilization is, thanks to our fathers, cleared away. So let's pause here and remind ourselves that these aren't the words of a punk rocker or of a wild-eyed bomb-throwing anarchist. They are the words of an elder statesman whom many regarded as a visionary and sage. Capital P, progress, considered to be the spirit of the age, was being invoked by him in its dual guise of creator and destroyer. Of course, anybody talking in this way today would be shot down in flames. Just imagine how the Murdoch juggernaut might react with all of their fake outrage and willful obfuscation. However, if we're going to call a spade, capitalist production then as now relies on the perpetual creation of obsolescence. Capital P, progress, whichever way we choose to define it, brings with it winners and losers, victors and vanquished, establishing and continuing to re-establish a gulf between present and past, between one generation and the next. It's a defining feature of modernity, whether we like it or not. Quote, "It's true that the great tradition is lost and that the new one hasn't been created." Baudelaire wrote that in 1846, at the time when he began noting the distinctive features of an emerging modernity. Modernity he defined as the transitory, the fugitive, the contingent, qualities that are exemplified by Impressionist painting, for example. But let's consider this condition of the transitory, the fugitive, the contingent as being an ambiguous state between appearing and disappearing, forming and disintegrating, associating and disassociating, creation and destruction. There is a distinctive modernist poetics I want to explore in this lecture, and the poet Stéphane Mallarmé is its great exemplar, where the role of negation has become paramount in modern art, where destruction and annihilation are assumed to be a precondition to and a dialectical partner to artistic creation. One startling fact will emerge in the course of our investigation, which is that all the artists who interest us in this regard are acutely aware of belonging to a revolutionary age. The French Revolution of 1789 and the succession of shockwaves that ensued from it seem to be uppermost in the rationale of these sweeping and radical cultural changes. During the time of revolution, as Victor Hugo himself put it, it is impossible that there should not be a revolution in men's minds. That comes from the preface to Cromwell, his play, published in 1827. Baudelaire left no doubt about Delacroix's historical and spiritual roots in a revolutionary mentality. He wrote, Eugène Delacroix has always preserved the traces of his revolutionary origin. And here is how Baudelaire substantiated this assertion. Quote, Delacroix puts forth and advocates what we admire most in him: the violence, the suddenness of gesture, the turbulence of his compositions. The thematic of revolutionary insurrection, then, may be overt in Delacroix's painting, but it can also make itself felt indirectly, implicitly, metaphorically, through the violence, the suddenness of gesture, the turbulence of his compositions, as, for example, in the Bark of Dante, the painting that won Delacroix his early fame in 1822, and many other examples we could cite. The great point being made here by Baudelaire is that the psychosocial disturbances set in motion by a revolution, that is to say, by a civil war, these don't just express themselves representationally in terms of subject matter as depiction, they also affect pictorial expression formally. And that's what I want to explore in this lecture, the revolution in pictorial form we call modernism, vis-a-vis the revolution in poetic language, in poetic convention that developed in parallel to it. The barricades in Paris during the 1830 insurrection are literally depicted in Delacroix's painting Liberty Leading the People, and they were also described magnificently by Victor Hugo in Les Miserables. Let's have a look at his tremendous representation of events. This barricade was furious. It hurled to the clouds an inexpressible clamor. At certain moments, when provoking the army, it was covered with throngs and tempest. A tumultuous crowd of flaming heads crowned it. A swarm filled it. It had a thorny crest of guns, of sabres, of cudgels, of axes, of pikes, and of bayonets. A vast red flag flapped in the wind. Shouts of command, songs of attack, the roll of drums, the sobs of women, and bursts of gloomy laughter from the starving were to be heard there. It was huge and living, and like the back of an electric beast, there proceeded from it little flashes of lightning. The spirit of revolution covered with its cloud this summit where rumbled that voice of the people which resembles the voice of God. A strange majesty was emitted by this titanic basket of rubbish. It was a heap of filth, and it was Sinai. This ending with a stunning paradox, a heap of filth on the one hand, and on the other, Mount Sinai, where in the Bible the prophet Moses confers with Jehovah. In this extraordinary paragraph, the abject and the epic, a titanic basket of rubbish, and an awe-inspiring intimation of the disembodied voice of the people. In the midst of tragedy and ruin, the transcendent spirit of liberty makes itself felt. The mixture of objective description and vivid figurative language in this paragraph is extremely effective. The barricade is a living entity, monstrous and appalling, yet made intelligible to the viewer. The paragraph ends with a momentous zinger, and even though I'm no adept at literary theory, I'm able to anticipate how some literary theorists would want to deal with it. The tropes of the sublime, of epiphany, and of aporia would restore Victor Hugo's text to the safe categorical norms of rhetorical convention, which is not something I intend to do. However, some would categorize it as an epiphany, in other words, as similar to or as a kind of mystical revelation. The mystic St. Nicholas of Cusa, who lived in the 15th century, is usually credited for coining the phrase coincidence of opposites, which relates to his intimation of how to approach the knowledge of God. The word aporia is used by Jacques Derrida and his acolytes, referring to an insoluble contradiction or logical disjunction. But the majority of literary theorists would see the coincidence of opposites as characteristic of an aesthetic genre they call the sublime. Victor Hugo would no doubt have recognized the keynote of the sublime in his shattering epiphany, witnessing the heroism and the tragedy of the barricades. The sublime was, of course, a very persistent feature in all the arts of Romanticism, yet for various political and ideological reasons, Romanticism only appeared on the French cultural scene decades later than it had appeared in England and in Germany. In England, a revolution in poetic language and a revolution in visual representation had long been manifest in Turner's painting and in the publication of Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads, to pick the most obvious examples. Turner made quite a specialty of paintings of calamities, and it's by no means irrelevant to associate them with the wipeout of the Ancien Regime, and to apply to them the same the penetrating words that Baudelaire applied to Delacroix's compositions. And by the way, Mallarmé's last great poem took a shipwreck as its subject, and at certain points there was an eerie similarity to a poem about a shipwreck that Victor Hugo had published in 1883 in the third installment of La Légende des siècles. I'll need to reacquaint you briefly with the important precedents in English Romanticism before we approach the revolution in poetic language effected by Mallarmé in France, and for two very compelling reasons. Firstly, because the whole generation of Victor Hugo, as well as in the unique person of Stéphane Mallarmé, they were all thoroughgoing Anglophiles, as well as being self-conscious revolutionaries and republicans in their political beliefs. Victor Hugo's first verse drama, Cromwell, was about an English regicide, the British Revolution, its constitutional monarchy, and the relative tolerance and freedom of expression enjoyed by Britishers were held up for admiration by the Romantic generation in France. The cultural historian Anne-Martin Fougier recounts how there were regular get-togethers every Wednesday evening in the studio of the painter Delacluse, when artists and writers would read, interpret, and translate Byron and Shakespeare, and in so doing brush up their English. These assemblies were very much part of Victor Hugo's circle. As for Mallarmé, he spent most of 1863 living in London, obtaining his qualification to teach English in French schools, which remained his source of income for the next 30 years. If you visit his country house at Roulan, which is now a museum, you'll see that among his prized possessions were numerous books in English in luxury editions. The other important reason to touch base with those English Romantic precursors is to acknowledge the profound impact made on them by the French Revolution. Wordsworth was 19 years old, Coleridge 17, Turner 14, when the news of the revolution in France reached them. John Ruskin considered this painting, Ulysses deriding Polyphemus, to be, quote, the central picture of Turner's career, unquote. And I wouldn't want to argue with him here. Any contemporary of Turner's would instantly recognize the afflatus of triumph in this glorious sunburst, and would equate the sunrise with the dawning of liberty, a stock emblem of revolutionary optimism. Furthermore, the reference to Homer's Odyssey in this scene is easily decoded. Ulysses and his crew are setting sail, having escaped enslavement by the monstrous tyrant Polyphemus, a giant whose colossal figure you'll begin to deduce from his huge knees profiled on the distant mountainside. This is an allegory about the overcoming of tyranny and the triumph of liberty, light prevailing over darkness, hope prevailing over despair, reason prevailing over unreason. And here's a famous reminiscence, Wordsworth recalling the sense of exhilaration among susceptible young persons in that bright dawn. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. O times in which the meagre, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law, and statute took at once the attraction of a country in romance. What we have here is an expression of skepticism and scorn of convention, scorn of normalcy, if you like, that became so characteristic of modern times. In its historical context, Wordsworth's stance is much less commonplace and puerile than you might think, implying a principled revolt against established authority. But let's continue where we left off. When reason seemed the most to assert her rights, when most intent on making of herself a prime enchantress to assist the work which was going on in her name. Reason was the buzzword of the Enlightenment and was considered to be an emancipating force ushering in liberty, equality, and fraternity. From close quarters, of course, the revolution of 1789 could look like a catastrophe involving a great deal of bloodletting, ruin, and doom. But from a distant shore, with no direct experience of its violence and turmoil, Wordsworth's first lines say it all. Bliss it was in that dawn to be alive. For a susceptible person, young, idealistic like Wordsworth, the rupture that the revolution opened between past and present, and the sense of unlimited possibility that it had ushered in, could lead a creative individual into unprecedented experiments with new pictorial or literary forms, as well as the possibility of taking on completely novel subject matter. Wordsworth's contemporary commentator William Hazlitt said as much, and said it so well that I can't deprive you of a direct quotation. For Hazlitt, the new poetic idiom, launched in Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, quote, is one of the innovations of the time. It partakes of, and is carried along with, the revolutionary movement of our age. The political changes of the day are the model on which he formed and conducted his poetical experiments. His muse is a leveling one. It proceeds on a principle of equality and strives to reduce all things to the same standard. It relies upon its own resources and disdains external show and relief. It takes the commonest events and objects as a test to prove that nature is always interesting from its inherent truth and beauty. So remarkable this, especially because of the date when it was written. In effect, you're getting a preliminary glimpse of the mindset of the French Impressionists, whose muse was most definitely a leveling one, that's for sure, and who arrived in the public eye a good 40 years after Hazlitt's essay was published and 60-plus years after Wordsworth's lyrical ballads were published. In Wordsworth's poetic revolution, according to Hazlitt, quote, all the traditions of the age are obliterated and effaced. We begin de novo. We begin from the new, on a tabula rasa of poetry. Hazlitt's appraisal of Wordsworth is from his book, The Spirit of the Age. In case you're wondering where we're going and think I may be leading you on a merry chase, I've been trying to hunt back and locate the early inklings of certain presuppositions and attitudes that become characteristic and indeed definitive of modern art in its broadest sense, and I trust that this circuitous approach will serve to lessen the shock and mitigate the sheer strangeness of the poetic achievement of Mallarmé. But one thing I need to establish very definitely, something which became so important to the modernist mindset, and it is this: how, when, and who began to acknowledge the key role that disorientation, rupture, and negation might play in the workings of the creative imagination. Stéphane Mallarmé is regarded fairly generally as a founding modernist poet, and by some as the founding modernist poet. Precursor of a great deal of avant-garde poetry written in the 20th century and right into our own time. He's also a byword for difficulty, for obscurity, which is something he deliberately sought, and for reasons that we should be able to recognize and respect, given all we have seen and heard so far. Many of the markers that we identified in previous art from the Revolutionary Age are amalgamated and intensified in Mallarmé's poetic practice. This poem belongs to a group of three that have always been published together, and each of them is known by its first line, which is, in effect, its title. So here we have Une dentelle sabolie. We're going to read it together, but don't panic. You're going to get a fair understanding of it. You're going to get something unique and useful out of the experience. I can assure you of that. And if things begin to seem too weird, please try to consider this with the indulgence you might give to some outlandish performance art that doesn't altogether lack interest and doesn't go on for too long. Une dentelle sabolie. You can see it's very short. Unlike Victor Hugo's 48-plus volumes, Mallarmé's life's work can fit comfortably into a single book. This poem is a sonnet, a Petrarchan sonnet. It has a rhyme scheme. It divides into 2 quatrains and 2 tercets, 2 sections of 4 lines, 2 sections of 3 lines. And it is a compact object typographically, as well as in the concision and intensive abbreviation of its language and figurative imagery. Une dentelle sabolie, that's how you would normally say it, but this is poetry, not prose. And French poetry, up till this time, was strictly metrical, with a meter measured in syllables. And these are lines of 8 syllables. So it can't be une dentelle sabolie. It has to be une dentelle sabolie. Everything that makes poetry poetry and not prose. Mallarmé, as a fountainhead of modernism, is going to accentuate and entrench in no uncertain terms. So, une dentelle sabolie. What is it saying? Une dentelle is a piece of lace work. It could be a veil, it could be a lace curtain, it could be a lace bedspread. They were all household articles prevalent at the time. Or it could be just a small piece of individual handiwork, something intricately wrought, which is maybe a metaphor for the intensively crisscrossing play of sound and sense, the patterning of language in a poem. But the line is une dentelle sabolie. The piece of lace is abolished. The mental image proposed to the reader is given and immediately cancelled. That's very characteristic of Mallarmé, the use of negation, and he does it in the first line, just as the poem gets underway. Une dentelle sabolie, dans le doute du jeu suprême, un entrouvrir comme un blasphème, qu'absence éternelle de lit. An unspecified item made of lace is abolished in the doubt of the supreme game. Game has a capital letter, so it's the major game, the cosmic game, the game of life, which gives and takes away. Un entr'ouvrir comme un blasphème. Entr'ouvrir is to open very slightly, to stand ajar like a blasphemy. There's a door implied, a threshold, a narrow aperture with a limited vision it affords us. It's likened to a blasphemy, another allusion to the cosmic game, to the presence and workings of God or of fate, and we're confronted with an abomination, a blasphemy. And what is revealed to us is only the eternal absence of bed. Bed here doesn't have an article. It isn't a bed or the bed, just bed, which is un lit in French. And the word is an echo of the first line, a sort of pun, because aboli contains lit, bed, and the absence of bed, the bed abolished, is prefigured in aboli. So now the lacy something, a kind of veil, an analogy for the text itself maybe, looks like it is referring to a lace bedspread. But the bed is also presented to the reader and simultaneously withdrawn. Bed, le lit, is a favorite figure for Mallarmé, because to read in French is lire, and I read in French is je lis. He reads, il lit, she reads, elle lit. So the bed and the book, the unoccupied bed and the blank page, the bed as the location of dreaming and procreation. This is how a poet like Mallarmé associates words and images. This is what makes his poetry so different from prose and so thought-provoking. Now there comes a breathtakingly beautiful segue. C'est unanime blanc conflit d'une guirlande avec la même, enfoui contre la vitre blême, flotte plus qu'il ensevelit. This unanimous white conflict. There's a bizarre association of unanimity and conflict, a coincidence of opposites. This unanimous white conflict of a garland with the same, or of a garland with itself, fled against the pallid window pane, floats more than it buries. So it becomes more probable now that the dentelle is a lace curtain stirred by the breeze, its movement characterized by a unanimous white conflict, and the lace curtain incorporates the motif of a garland, which is also, so to speak, conflicted by the air current and runs up against the pale light of the window pane. A whole sequence of white phenomena are getting threaded together. They're getting enlaced. The bed, the page, the curtain, the light coming through the window, and the sound of lit, bed, reed recurs in conflit, conflict. A garland is traditionally an emblem of triumph for crowning a victor, but it can also be a funeral wreath. And in this context, here again, it's a go-between for totally contradictory ideas. Because of its ambivalence, it floats more than it buries, the last line of the second quatrain. Here again, the dialectic of giving and taking away, the supreme game, which is a dialectic of flux, of presence and absence, occurs at a threshold, which is now understood to be a window casement, but then the scene shifts again. Mais chez qui du rêve se dort, tristement dort une mandore au creux néant musicien. So now another leap of genius. Mais chez qui, in the abode of or in the ambit of someone who is made golden by dream. But here again there is a double entendre, or actually a triple entendre. To sleep in French is dormir. He sleeps is il dort. And the word for gold is or. So we're enlacing the thematic of sleep and dream now with goldenness as well as with music. Mais chez qui du rêve se dort, tristement dort une mandore au creux néant musicien. In the ambit of someone who is made golden by dream, sadly a mandola. A mandola is a stringed instrument like a lute. A mandola sleeps, musician of hollow nothingness. Words that can contain the sound of gold, d'or, mandora, all in the space of two lines, like the rhythm of someone breathing, and then this image of a musical instrument arrives, set in that fabulously paradoxical phrase, musician of hollow nothingness. The abandoned, silent instrument, like the billowing curtain, like the unwritten page, like the unoccupied bed, is at one at the same time empty, void, and sterile, yet somehow pregnant with unrealized, unlimited potential. According to Mallarmé himself, language recovers in poetry, and specifically in his own poetry, the quality of virtuality, which is to say, its power of possibility. And that's the payoff of the last tercet. Tel que vers quelques fenêtres, selon nul ventre que le sien, filial on aurait pu naître. Such as towards some window, according to no belly but its own, or no belly but his own, or no belly but her own, filial, one, that is someone, you or I, could have been born. Ending with another weird, crabbed, deliberately crumpled proposition. However, the window has already been established as a landmark in the poem with its billowing curtain, and the billow is now a belly, swelling in pregnancy, pregnant with thought, pregnant with expression, pregnant with poetry, and attached to the ideas of birth and filiation. Filial contains the sound, the word fil, which is a thread in French, and fenêtre and naître contain the sound of être, the verb to be, or a noun. An être is a being. Être ou pas être, to be or not to be, the famous Shakespearean question, that was something that obsessed Mallarmé. We're now fully aware of the fairly strenuous effort required to transpose the substance of a poem across a language barrier. For a native French speaker, the texture and the music of this language will please the ear, and the admirable correctness and elegance of the sonnet form will be apparent. However, negotiating the obstacle course of Mallarmé's syntax and making sense of the scatter of his cryptic imagery almost puts the native French reader on a level playing field with a well-intentioned foreigner. Mallarmé brings a very similar sensation of estrangement to that experienced by a Frenchman trying to read English. English poetry, with its rich and elaborate figuration, its rich and elaborate figurative language, is very alien to the language of the French classics, as is Latin poetry. Trying to read Latin poetry with its extraordinary liberty of word order would be equivalently alien to the native literary idioms. Well, the singularity of Mallarmé isn't absolute, not by any means, in fact. The later poetry of Victor Hugo was well-nigh obsessed with the mysterious and with the unknowable, drawing a veil over the apparent intelligibility of the universe and all that it contains. As Baudelaire put it, Victor Hugo's acute perceptiveness had revealed to him abysses. He saw mystery everywhere. Likewise, for Mallarmé, in his own words, poetry is the expression of the mysterious sense of the aspects of existence. Victor Hugo read Mallarmé's poetry attentively and charmingly referred to him as cher poète impressionniste, dear impressionist poet. A most remarkable insight, because in 1864, completely independently, at a time when Impressionist painting didn't yet exist, Mallarmé gave the following description of the new approach he had taken in his poetry. Quote, to paint not the thing, but the effect that it produces. By not directly naming things, their absence could generate hints, metaphors, analogies, and these could provide the substance of a poem whose ultimate resistance to any certainty of interpretation would accentuate the materiality and the plasticity of its language, as well as the tenuousness and subtlety, the tenor of modernity itself, the ephemeral, the fleeting, the contingent, as Baudelaire had put it. The new was to be made out of the rubble of the past, since traditional idioms in poetry had been contaminated and compromised by fashions, by revolutions, by progress, and could now be likened to rubble left in the aftermath of the cataclysms of the recent past. Quote, to name an object is to suppress 3/4 of the enjoyment of the poem, which consists of slowly putting two and two together. To suggest it, that is the dream. It is the perfect use of this mystery that constitutes the symbol, to evoke an object little by little in order to display a state of mind, or conversely, to choose an object and produce a state of mind from it by a series of decipherments. So Mallarmé realizes that words are not transparent. They're not attached to fixed meanings. The reader isn't merely a passive receiver of ideas and illusions communicated by an author. Making sense of a text is transactional. The reader is a participant in the creation of meaning and in making sense of a text. Consequently, readers ought to be granted, quote, the delicious joy of thinking that they themselves are creating the poem. Those are Mallarmé's own words. Here you see Mallarmé in the living room of his apartment in the Rue de Rome, in a street behind the Gare Saint-Lazare, in the 18th arrondissement of Paris. Behind him is his portrait painted by Edouard Manet in 1876, the same year that Mallarmé's most famous poem, L'après-midi d'un faune, The Afternoon of the Faun, was published. Mallarmé had inherited, so to speak, his deep friendship with Manet from his precursor poet Charles Baudelaire. After Baudelaire's death in 1867, he'd also inherited Baudelaire's enthusiasm for the writings of Edgar Allan Poe. Here are two etchings by Manet portraying Baudelaire and Poe. Manet provided illustrations for Mallarmé's translation of Poe's The Raven, and you'll recognize the man on the chair looking up at the raven. It's a likeness of Mallarmé. Mallarmé's books of poetry were very slender and came out in tiny editions of 100, editions of 60, which was not indicative of elitism, as some would have it, so much as it was a symptom of his intense cultural pessimism. He didn't expect people to like or to accept his poetry, and in this surmise he was, of course, correct. The people who read him were poets, artists, and musicians, people in whom a sense of art was already highly developed. For me, that doesn't constitute elitism, but I realize that for others it does. As I understand it, Mallarmé was writing for people who read, i.e., people who are resourceful, liberated, and adventurous in their ability to think and feel. In 1876, he published in a tiny edition L'après-midi d'un faune, for which Manet provided a frontispiece, some vignettes, and a tailpiece. Manet's images were delightful in their simplicity and mock naivety. They had a quasi-Japanese refinement, which was perfectly in keeping with the text. In fact, Mallarmé was dead set against any graphic imagery which might compete and interfere with the imagery of his poetry. And Manet's discretion, gentle humor, and aesthetic fastidiousness provided a perfect accompaniment to the text. Mallarmé fed, housed, and clothed himself, his wife and daughter, on the modest income of a schoolteacher. Yet he kept open house every Tuesday evening, and those famous Tuesdays, those mardis, held in his apartment in the Rue de Rome, attracted some of the greatest writers of the day, as well as visual artists of the avant-garde. especially the Impressionists. Monet was a regular guest, so were Degas, Renoir, and Rodin. On the left is a photograph taken by Degas of Mallarmé and Renoir, with, in the mirror, Mallarmé's wife and daughter sitting in the background. Renoir also painted Mallarmé's portrait, and there you see one version of it hanging in the study of Mallarmé's country house at Vallotton, a house which is now a museum. Whistler was another distinguished visitor, and his affinity and interaction with Mallarmé was most interesting and deserves a considerably closer examination than it has so far received from art historians. Whistler provided the frontispiece for the first edition of Mallarmé's collected poems, Poésies, and in return, Mallarmé rendered Whistler a great service, translating Whistler's famous lecture, The 10 O'Clock, into French. There was also the matter of gifts from Whistler to Mallarmé. There were 2 lithographs, not these ones, but similar to them, where the facades of buildings provide a sort of doubling of the pictorial surface, emphasizing the picture plane as a facade, where the image is as much a matter of what is left out as what is kept in. In 1884, the novelist Joris Karl Eastman published a very bizarre book, À rebours, translated into English as Against the Grain or Against Nature. The protagonist is a fabulously wealthy aesthete who indulges his taste for the rarest, most exquisite, most far-out, most perverse things, and he discovers a virtually unknown poet who writes baffling and outlandish verse that denatures the French language and renders it almost incomprehensible. The poet in question was no invention of Eastman's. It was Mallarmé, who was mentioned by name with a couple of his poems printed verbatim. The success of the book rocketed Mallarmé to notoriety. Edvard Munch, who visited Paris in 1896, attended some of Mallarmé's Mardi. He made the lithographic portrait on the left, and on the right an etching by Gauguin done in 1891. Throughout the 1890s, right up to his death in 1898, Mallarmé was the reigning literary deity of a great journal, La Revue Blanche, which came out twice a month, and that's another portrait of Mallarmé by Félix Vallotton, a house artist for the journal. One of the proprietors of La Revue Blanche, who was also its co-editor, Thaddée Notanson, was a neighbor of Mallarmé's. Their country houses at Vallotton were more or less side by side. The outstanding artist in the Notansons' social circle was Édouard Vuillard, and that's a little painting Vuillard did of Mallarmé's house at Vallotton. Vuillard had been a schoolboy at the Lycée Condorcet, the posh boys' school in Paris, where Mallarmé had taught English till 1884. From 1891 onwards, Vuillard began going to Mallarmé's Mardi, and some of the most extraordinary paintings Vuillard did in the mid-1890s were where I think he'd fallen most deeply under Mallarmé's spell, and they give us reason to pause and take stock of Vuillard's strategy of dissociation, disorientation, and fragmentation. Vuillard pursues this strategy with such determination and so much talent that the results can sometimes look like abstract paintings or like images that could become entirely unrecognizable with very little effort on the painter's part. Representation, naturalism, seems to have become dysfunctional and irrational. The unity of figures and the integrity of objects is no longer assumed and no longer guaranteed. All the distinctions and hierarchies that common sense imposes have collapsed or are inverted in this scene. The lively background has grown over-assertive and has devoured the foreground. Pieces and patches of color, tone, and texture have struck up conversations among themselves. The yellow flash on a woman's sleeve is no longer part of a sleeve or of a woman, but is dialoguing with the yellow lampshade and the yellow flowers. Are they flowers in a vase or part of a tapestry behind? And that astonishing pink hand. Nothing is explicitly connected. Nothing is explicitly descriptive. The sense we obtain of a hand, a flower, a newspaper, derives from where they occur in relation to other elements in the composition. Their meaning or their representational function is determined by the syntax of the composition. The sensation of being plunged into uncertainty, of being confronted by signs that are essentially opaque and discontinuous, which function purely through connotation, that resist being naturalized, that refuse any kind of predictability or easy legibility. These are all effects we readily associate with Mallarmé, and no doubt they derive from Vuillard's fascination with Mallarmé's poetry and from his acquaintance with the great man himself. The characteristics of fragmentation, dissociation, abstraction that we noted in Vuillard are reiterated in a somewhat different way in the classic Cubist paintings by Picasso and Braque. These two paintings are by Braque, painted 15 or so years later than the Vuillards we looked at. As with Vuillard, yet even more so, these paintings tend to slow down the viewer, make the viewer search. They engage the viewer as an imaginative collaborator. The fractured lines and facet planes of these paintings cluster together. They set up very dense and elaborate patterns of tone and texture, and the obvious physicality and opacity of the deposits of paint on the surface seem to resist our desire to penetrate, to identify, to naturalize any image. Then, little by little, things seem to stir. Things begin to add up. We infer more. We start to get the hang of the artist's representational intentions. That's a very Mallarméan experience, of course. According to Picasso and Braque's dealer, Henry Kahnweiler, Mallarmé's notions were indeed embraced by Braque primarily and by Picasso secondarily. The multitude of string instruments depicted in Cubist paintings and sculptures and drawings harks back to the mandola in Une dentelle sabolie. Braque and Picasso develop a characteristically Mallarméan strategy. The setting proposed in a painting or drawing is simultaneously withheld and negated, stated and abolished. What this strategy demonstrates is that a sign, any sign, every sign, has a hollow in its heart. It encloses an absence, and imagination is the faculty of conjuring presence out of absence and of projecting significance into the latency or the virtuality of symbols, ciphers, and signifiers, whether these be in poetry or in painting. And so, to conclude where we started, Victor Hugo's state funeral, which for Mallarmé had a very particular significance. Mallarmé published a manifesto of sorts in acknowledgement and in defense of the revolution in poetic language that he and some of his contemporaries, Verlaine, Rimbaud, Jules Laforgue, most notably, had accomplished. The article was called Crise de vers, Crisis of Verse, and it was published in La Revue Blanche in September 1895, 10 years after Victor Hugo's death. In point of fact, Mallarmé's poetry had always been a poetry of crisis, from go to woe. Crise de vers contains a very good joke at Victor Hugo's expense. Hugo, the oracle, who was never silent, Hugo, the author of 48 volumes and then some, Hugo, the incessant versifier, was dead, and the French reader, whose reading habits of reading Victor Hugo for 60 years, could only be disconcerted. Given Hugo's awesome facility as a versifier, he had evidently gobbled up every form of prose, philosophy, rhetoric, and history, and set them all into verse, to such an extent that Hugo had become the personification of verse. In effect, he had confiscated from others all speculative thought, discourse, and narrative, almost to the point of preempting others from venturing to speak or write. According to Mallarmé, he was a monument in a desert where silence only prevailed in the far distant margins. In other words, Hugo was a very noisy oracle. This titanic writer created such an empire in verse that he had made verse coextensive with literature itself. And so everything not just represented, but incarnated by such a prolix, egocentric author of genius, someone abundantly confident of his rapport with his vast readership, this great man of the people and artist to the masses. His passing was truly the end of an era, and there was no possibility whatsoever of turning back. If Hugo, in his lifetime, had epitomized modern French literature, epitomized modern poetry, his passing had ipso facto created a crisis of verse. This was Mallarmé's little joke, a bittersweet joke he was also telling at his own expense. Thank you for your interest. See you again.